The morning began with a silence that did not belong in a house filled with children. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the walls, heavy and unnatural, as if every sound had been swallowed whole before it could escape. Anyone standing outside would have felt it before they even stepped through the door. Something was terribly wrong. Inside the white single-story home, toys were scattered across the hallway floor. A teddy bear lay on its side, one button eye staring upward like it had witnessed something unspeakable. A baby bottle rested on its side, its milk dried into a streak that looked like a frozen tear. These small, everyday objects whispered a story of innocence, a story violently interrupted. She was the kind of mother people remembered without trying. Beautiful, soft-spoken, patient in ways most parents only dreamed of. A mother of 6 who carried the weight of life with quiet strength. Her 4 toddler quadruplets were her world, her older 2 children her pride, her home her sanctuary, and yet, on this morning, that sanctuary had been shattered. She lay motionless in the center of her bedroom, the carpet beneath her stained with the aftermath of a fight no one heard. Her hands were marked with desperate scrapes, a last attempt to hold on to life for the children who depended on her. The room showed signs of a brutal struggle, drawers pulled open, curtains torn, a lamp smashed against the floor. Nearby, the toddlers sat together, crying in confusion. They were too young to understand why their mother was not waking up, too young to name the terror that had unfolded only feet away from them. They clung to each other instinctively, 4 small bodies huddled in fear beside the one person who had always protected them. When police arrived, the scene carved itself into their memories with a cruelty they would never forget. A murdered mother, 4 crying toddlers, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no fingerprints, no usable DNA. The killer had left behind nothing but devastation. It was the kind of case detectives hated: emotional, violent, empty of leads, and worst of all, cold. Within days, suspicion scattered blindly in every direction. A jealous ex, a random break-in, a stranger passing through town, nothing fit, everything collapsed. Her family begged for justice, but justice had no interest in revealing itself. Weeks passed, then months. Slowly, painfully, the world moved on. But in every cold case, there is one detail waiting to be remembered, one detail that quietly refuses to die. On the day no one suspected anything unusual, the gardener had been trimming hedges across the street. He remembered a car parked just a little too long, its engine idling, its driver watching the house with stillness that felt wrong even then. A silver sedan, slightly dented on the side, and a license plate he didn't realize was important until the news broke. It was only a fragment, a few numbers, a partial memory, but it was enough to scratch at his mind, enough to plant doubt, enough that, weeks later, he walked into the police station with the thought that maybe, just maybe, he had seen something that mattered. But by then the case had gone cold. Detectives scribbled the note politely, thanked him, filed it, and never followed up. The plate was too incomplete, too vague, too late. The mother was buried. The children were placed with relatives. And the world pretended the story was over. Yet something lingered beneath the surface, a quiet current waiting for the right moment to break through. In the years that followed, the children grew, but shadows clung to the memory of that morning. In the evidence storage room, the mother's case file gathered dust. In the mind of one detective, the scene replayed over and over, refusing to fade like the rest of his unsolved work. The injustice hung in the air like a storm cloud that refused to rain. Then, on the 8th anniversary of the murder, something happened that changed everything. A car accident, late at night, a silver sedan, old and beaten, with a dent on the side. The driver, a small-time criminal known for petty theft and illegal deals, was arrested at the scene. Inside the vehicle, police found forged license plates, and beneath the false ones, the original plate remained attached, the same plate the gardener had partially remembered, The numbers matched. It was the first breath of life the case had received in nearly a decade. A plate from an old memory suddenly pulled into present reality. The forgotten clue that should have cracked the case years ago now screamed for attention. Investigators reopened the file. The cold, case detective who had never forgotten that Mother walked into the evidence room and pulled out the dusty folder. Photos slid across the table, the crime scene frozen in time, the mother's last moments, the children's frightened faces, the silent house. This time, no one dared ignore the plate, but as soon as the small, time criminal was questioned, something felt wrong. He fit the car, he fit the habits, he fit the world of crime, but he did not fit the murder, the brutality of it, the motive, the connection to the mother. None of it made sense. Still, his car had been there. His plates matched. His history was messy. Detectives felt the old frustration rising again. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he was covering for someone. Maybe something darker was hidden in the silence. As the interrogation deepened, the criminal broke. But not in the way they expected. He confessed to being near the house that day, but he did not confess to the murder. He claimed he had been paid to watch the house, paid to report when the husband left for work, paid to stay silent, paid by a man he only knew as a shadow, a man who hid behind burner phones and cash payments, a man with no face and no name, a man who had no known connection to the victim. But the moment he mentioned the shadow figure, the room shifted. Detectives exchanged glances. Something bigger had been hiding behind this case all along. The small, time criminal trembled as he spoke. He described the voice of the shadow figure, the instructions, the warning to never speak of it again. And then he said 6 words that turned the entire investigation upside down. It was all because of the kids. That was when everything snapped into focus. A decade-long custody battle. A buried motive. A betrayal no one saw coming. The detectives realized the mother had not died in a random crime. She had been murdered in a conspiracy carefully crafted by someone who had waited years for the right moment to strike. And now that shadow was finally exposed. The revelation hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Those 6 words spoken by the trembling criminal echoed through the interrogation room. It was all because of the kids. They carried the weight of something unsaid, something ancient and poisonous. Detectives felt a shift in the room, the kind that warns of a truth long buried, clawing its way back into the light. The cold, case detective, a man who had never forgotten the image of 4 toddlers crying beside their mother, leaned forward as if he could pull answers out of the air. Every instinct in him whispered that the killing had never been about random violence. It had been pointed, personal, calculated, and now that calculation revealed itself like a fracture running through the past. The criminal described how the job had come to him through whispers. No written instructions, no meetings, only anonymous calls routed through untraceable numbers. A voice calm, emotionless, giving orders with the cold precision of someone who had rehearsed the moment for years. Watch the house, confirm when the husband leaves, stay out of sight, do not interfere, do not ask questions. He had been told the rest would be handled by someone else, a professional, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The detectives pressed harder, their questions slicing into the man's carefully guarded fear. He said he had not known what was coming. He thought it was surveillance, maybe a burglary, maybe intimidation. Nothing more, until news of the woman's murder spread through the town the next day and the shadow figure disappeared. He had expected trouble, but not this, not a murder, not children left with their mother's body, not the hellscape that crime scene became. In the years that followed, the criminal claimed he had been haunted by guilt, but fear had kept him silent. Not fear of police, but fear of the man who hired him. A man who, according to him, seemed capable of anything. The shadow figure was not someone who panicked, not someone who left loose ends. He took precautions, erased footprints, ensured obedience through silence. The detectives knew they were no longer dealing with a simple cold case. They were facing a conspiracy wrapped in time, designed by someone with a long memory and a deeper motive. The criminals' shaking hands were proof enough that this shadow had not only existed, but had controlled the entire operation like a puppeteer. They pressed again for a name, a description, anything. But all the criminal could offer was the faint memory of a phrase the shadow figure repeated on the phone. Something chilling. Something that, at the time, he had brushed off. But now, years later, the meaning was unmistakable. A man should never lose what belongs to him. That was when the detectives felt the temperature drop. Ownership, possession, control, words woven with obsession, words soaked in the bitterness of her rivalry, words that could only come from someone who saw the victim not as a person, but as property. They dug deeper through old court filings, custody arrangements, legal disputes long forgotten. They combed through every document the mother had collected during her long, painful custody battle over her older children, a battle she had won, a battle that had left the losing party simmering with resentment. Her ex-husband, 10 years earlier, he had fought her in court, tried to paint her as unstable, tried to claim she was unfit, but the judge had seen through him. He lost not only custody but control. Control he believed he deserved. Control he thought was his right, and now his name resurfaced like a corpse rising in dark water. Detectives reviewed his history, his financial records, his movements. What emerged was not a clean life but a pattern. Hidden bank withdrawals, undisclosed cash payments, contacts with questionable individuals, and a sudden spike in behavior that suggested preparation, not in the weeks before the murder, but in the years before it. It was as if he had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike back, but something still didn't add up. The shadow figure described by the criminal didn't match the ex-husband's personality. The ex was emotional, impulsive, easily enraged. The shadow figure was methodical, detached, calculating. This did not feel like a man acting alone. This felt like a man hiring someone to do his thinking for him. Detectives realized they were staring at two layers of the truth: the bitter ex-husband with the motive, and the shadow figure who executed the plan. The two appeared connected, yet the threads between them were faint, hidden by years of silence. As they dug deeper, investigators uncovered a surprising connection. The ex-husband had a distant relative, a man who had once been involved in private security, a man who had a background in intelligence gathering, a man who had disappeared from public records years before the murder, someone who knew how to operate from the shadows and avoid detection. This man had been the strategist, the architect, the shadow figure. Pieces of the conspiracy began falling into place. The ex-husband, fueled by jealousy and bitterness, had wanted to hurt the mother in the worst possible way, but he lacked the ability to carry out something so clean, so undetectable. He needed someone who could plan it meticulously, someone who could remove himself from the crime entirely. His relative stepped in, for reasons still unknown, perhaps loyalty, perhaps money, perhaps a shared hatred. But what mattered most was that he had agreed to orchestrate every detail. They had spent months observing the mother's routines, studying her habits, learning when she was alone, learning the schedule of her husband, who had no idea he was being watched. The shadow figure knew precisely when to strike. Detectives realized the murder had been planned for weeks. The killer had entered the home while the mother was alone with her toddlers. The struggle showed she had fought back with everything she had. But the killer was stronger, trained, emotionless. He had left no evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA. He had vanished before the husband returned home. The conspiracy was brilliant in its cold-hearted simplicity. A bitter ex husband with motive, a shadow figure with skill, a hired watcher to mask their involvement, a professional killer to do the final act, each piece designed to hide the truth behind layers of misdirection. But now, for the first time, those layers were peeling back. The turning point struck when detectives found something buried deep in an old box of evidence, a photograph the mother had taken weeks before her death, a photograph of her children playing in the yard. But in the background, reflected faintly in the window of her car, was a figure standing across the street. The silhouette matched the description the criminal had given. The shadow had been caught without realizing it. The detectives scanned the image, enhanced it, and compared it with old employment files, surveillance photos, and the limited records they had of the ex-husband's relative. It was him. The shadow figure had been watching her himself. The moment the detective realized this, he felt the final shift. The investigation was no longer a puzzle, it was a countdown. The truth was rising. Justice was coming, and the shadow was about to be exposed. The photograph became the spark that burned through years of silence. In that faint reflection, detectives finally saw the truth staring back at them. The shadow figure had not been a ghost after all. He had stood in the open, confident, believing he would never be noticed. But the mother, without knowing it, had captured her own watcher, her final act of defiance, preserved in a single, unintentional frame. Investigators moved quickly, knowing the window for justice was narrow. Shadows tended to vanish when threatened, and this man had lived his life disappearing into cracks most people never saw. The cold, case detective stared at the photograph long after the others had left the room. He felt the weight of the mother's story pressing onto his chest, a life stolen, a truth buried, and children who had grown up under the echo of that morning. This was the moment the case demanded courage. The detective promised himself that this time the story would not end in dust and silence. They began tracing the shadow figure's movements through the years. He had lived quietly, using false names and unregistered phones. He traveled lightly, moved frequently, and left no digital footprint. But even ghosts leave marks. A security camera in a forgotten gas station, a train ticket purchased in cash, a rental cabin paid under someone else's identity. Slow, faint trails, but trails nonetheless. Detectives worked day and night, stitching together the shadow's path with a patience he had never expected from his pursuers. They went backward through a decade, pulling on threads he had left behind without noticing. With every new discovery, the detective felt the story tightening around the man like a snare. Meanwhile, the ex-husband was unraveling under the pressure of renewed scrutiny. He had lived the last 8 years believing he had outsmarted everyone. But guilt gnawed at him in small ways: failed relationships, anxiety, nightmares, a growing paranoia that one day someone would discover the truth. When detectives brought him in for questioning again, he tried to act surprised. But his eyes flickered with something darker: recognition, fear, the shifting of a man who realized his carefully constructed lie was collapsing. They laid the photograph in front of him. Not of the shadow figure, but of the mother alive, holding her children, with that faint silhouette behind her. A single picture that carried the beginning and end of everything. The ex-husband's face drained of color. His lips tightened. His eyes darted. He tried to breathe, but the air suddenly felt thin. Detectives watched his reaction closely. They didn't need his confession. They needed his fear. Within days, they located the shadow figure. He was living in a remote cabin outside a small mountain town, a place without neighbors, without phone lines, without anyone to ask questions. The kind of place men hide when their lives depend on staying unseen. The arrest was silent, calculated, the same way he had lived. The team moved at dawn, slipping through the trees, surrounding the cabin without a sound. When they entered, they found him awake, sitting at a small wooden table, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. He didn't run, he didn't fight. He looked at the detective with calm eyes, as if he had been expecting this moment for years, as if justice had finally caught up to the time he had stolen. The interrogation lasted hours. At first he said nothing. Silence was his shield. He had lived behind it his entire life, but photographs broke through where words failed. When detectives placed the reflection photo on the table, something flickered behind his eyes. A crack, a fracture. The detective told him the truth he could not escape. The mother had captured him. Her last, unintentional breath of resistance had marked him forever. She had left behind the only clue he had never prepared for. And it had survived 8 long years waiting to be seen. The shadow figure spoke slowly, coldly, without remorse. He admitted to orchestrating the plan. He spoke of surveillance, timing, strategy. Emotion never colored his voice. He described the ex-husband as a desperate man, a man willing to do anything to reclaim the children he believed were stolen from him. The shadow claimed he had simply provided a solution. He described the murder with chilling clarity. The forced entry with no sign left behind, the calculated attack, the silencing of a mother fighting for her children with her last breath. But he said nothing about the mother herself. No name, no humanity. To him, she had been an objective, not a person. What he didn't realize was that in exposing himself, he had sealed the fate of the man who hired him. With his confession recorded, detectives moved on the ex-husband. When they arrived at his home, he was shaking. Panic had hollowed his eyes. He knew the moment had come. Years of buried rage and bitterness crumbled as he was led away in handcuffs. For the first time in a decade, the mother's story began to breathe again. In the courtroom, the truth unfolded in waves. The small-time criminal testified how he was hired to watch the house. The detectives presented the photograph that had captured the shadow figure. Forensic experts reconstructed the timeline. And the shadow himself, emotionless and unapologetic, confirmed the conspiracy. The most powerful moment came when the detective read a statement written by the mother's oldest daughter. She had grown up haunted by questions, wondering why her mother never came back. She spoke of survival, of pain, of memories too sharp to hold, but she ended her statement with quiet strength. My mother fought until her last breath. Today, she finally wins. Her words broke the courtroom open. When the verdict came, it hit like thunder. The shadow figure sentenced without parole. The ex-husband convicted on charges that would keep him locked away for the rest of his life. The conspiracy shattered, exposed, burned to ash under the weight of justice. The detective visited the mother's grave afterward. It was quiet, peaceful, untouched by the violence that had once surrounded her. He placed the photograph on her stone, the one that had captured her children, her love, her defiance, and the shadow that had believed he could hide forever. The wind moved gently through the cemetery, carrying a sense of closure that had been denied far too long. In the end, it was not technology, nor luck, nor confession that solved the case. It was a mother's instinct, captured in a reflection she never noticed, guarding her children even after death. The final truth settled like the last scene in a film. A shadow had killed her, but her light exposed him. And justice, at last, stepped out of the darkness.